Welcome to another edition of The Gift of the Mormon Faith Crisis. I'm your host, John Dehlin. It is March 19th, 2019. And do we have a cool episode in store for you? I'm Dr. John Dehlin. And as always, I am accompanied by my brilliant, awesome, sophisticated, charming, wise other half. Tell us who you are.
Margi Dehlin. Glad to be here.
And joining us from Wichita, Kansas, home of Warren Buffett and the Koch brothers. Wait, he's in Omaha, Nebraska. Home of the Koch brothers, Natasha Helfer Parker.
Home of Natasha Helfer Parker.
I'm speechless.
Understandable.
Hello, everybody. I'm so glad to be here. We do have a great topic today. So, yes, happy to be here.
I forgot to mention the wise, brilliant, professional, experienced Natasha Helfer Parker.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, John. I appreciate it.
Natasha, tell us what you do for those who are joining us for the first time.
Okay, I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist and also a certified sex therapist. I specialize in faith transitions and sexuality and all things that have to do with mental health. Like, I don't specialize in all things that have to do with mental health, but I'm a mental health provider and offer a private practice and podcast that I'm part of, Mormon Mental Health Podcast, Mormon Sex Info Podcast, lots of things I'm involved with, and definitely love being part of this project. And you can find anything that I'm involved with at natashaparker.org.
Love it. Well, thanks for joining us, Natasha. We love having you. Tell us about you, my dear.
I am a certified life coach, and I specialize in life transition work for people. I also am the curator of the blog beautyinthenow.org. So you can check out all things Margi there.
Spell that for everybody.
Beauty in the Now. BEAUTYINTHENOW Wow, I feel like I need to practice that.
Yeah, you got to practice that.
Wow, it's like spelling bee. It's not even hard. Yeah. There you go.
I love how your O was becoming a zero.
I know, right? I was like, because I have to do that with our passwords sometimes in our computer. You make it trick.
Yeah.
All right, and I'm Dr. John Dehlin. I have a psychology, a PhD in clinical counseling psychology. I can be reached at johndehlin@gmail.com, johndehlin.com, or drjohndehlin@gmail.com. And I also take a small client base for people struggling in a faith crisis, working through a faith crisis, working through a mixed faith marriage, working through marriage conflict after a faith crisis. I do coaching, not therapy, even though I have a PhD and I'm trained and qualified to do therapy. I just do coaching, but I love it, and feel free to reach out. Okay, so that's our individual introductions. Let's make sure and start with our mission and our message. So, Margi, do you want to tell our listeners what our mission is so that we can stay centered?
Sure. So our mission is to provide positive, practical, and personal tips for navigating a Mormon faith crisis, or it's for those wishing to understand those in a faith crisis.
I love it. And Natasha, what's our message?
Well, we call this a gift, the gift of the Mormon faith crisis, which we always try to remind people, both people going through a faith crisis and people supporting those going through a faith crisis, that it doesn't often feel like a gift, especially at the beginning. And that's a big part of why we offer these services and this content and this, weekly podcast. But our hopeful message is that it can, like a lot of trials or difficulties in life, it can end up really giving wonderful gifts in return. So new perspectives, new relationships, new ways of looking at the world. And it can really be, I think as mental health practitioners and coaches, we use a lot of reframe. And so it's kind of like, how do you think about something in a more positive way? And that's what we're trying to do here at the Gift of the Mormon Faith Crisis.
I love it. Okay, as some may know, we do provide some events our motive with the events is purely to help people. We have no other motive than that. And we have a few coming up. Natasha, why don't you tell us about the Mixed Faith Marriage webinar, because that's coming up first.
Yeah, so we are going to be providing 3 nights of a live interactive webinar specifically for mixed faith marriages. John has, presented on this topic before, both with other professionals, and we've presented on it together. I just presented on it over Christmas break in Utah and got a lot of wonderful reviews. So we're going to kind of create a webinar format, and you can join us live for that. And it's going to be April 2nd, 9th, and 16th. So Tuesday evenings, depending on what, time zone you're in. So it's going to be 9 o'clock Mountain Standard Time, I believe. Am I correct on that?
Yep. April 2nd, 9th, and 16th.
Yes. And this will be interactive, but it also will be recorded. So if you can't join us on those nights, those webinars will be available for purchase afterwards. But I just wanted to, we'd love to have you join us as well. That would be ideal.
Yes, lots of people in pain, and that's a very technical topic that requires expert advice. And I don't know anyone who's got more experience than Natasha with mixed faith marriages.
I've been
and
doing
Margi
it
and
a
I are
long
no
time.
slouches in that
Yeah,
regard.
I think that you are also very good at that topic. And yeah, I think both of us have been working in that realm for over a decade with people. So it's important. It's important to be able to have a setting where both partners feel very heard, respected, like they're going to, because I think a lot of times what happens is the believer will want to see an LDS therapist. The non-believer will want to see a non-LDS therapist. And for me, what I have found to be very, very important is you find a culturally competent therapist who can keep their own kind of bias out of the way. And we've done a very good job at doing that. I ask that question specifically in my evaluation forms. And I always get very good reviews from both believers and non-believers and people in between. That they feel very safe and heard throughout these webinars. So please consider joining us. It'll be an excellent resource.
Amen.
Mm-hmm.
A couple other events coming up just really quickly. We are doing a monthly free series. I'm doing a monthly free series in Salt Lake City. We just had one last week on communicating with believing family and friends. In February, we did Navigating a Faith Crisis. April's event on April 10th is going to be Rebuilding Your Life After a Faith Crisis. It's at the Community of Christ building in Holiday, Utah, starting at 7 from 7 to 10. Please come. It's been wonderful. About 2/3 of the people that attended last time attended the first time. So a lot of people, and that was on a really snowy day. So we know that people are getting value because they're returning. So plan for that April 10th. We have other ones each month. You can check out the calendar on the Gift of the Mormon Faith Crisis Facebook podcast page. In addition, Julie de Azevedo Hanks and I are actually doing a mixed faith marriage retreat in Salt Lake City, April 12th and 13th. Julie is the daughter of Lex de Azevedo. She is, she's married to a bishop. She faithfully attends and is a believer on some level, probably a bit more of a progressive level. But she and I did this event in 2017. And we know, according to several attendees, that we saved at least a few marriages. This is something that Natasha and I would do regularly if we lived in the same town. That's not always possible, but I'm happy that Julie's able to do it, and I want to do it with Natasha as soon as we can work out schedules. But Salt Lake City, April 12th through 13th. Also, Natasha, do you want to talk about Kansas City, April 12th and 13th?
Yeah, and I just want to put in a plug for Julie as well. She's a dear friend and colleague of mine, and I think she does excellent work. So Kansas City, come on, Midwesterns, we can do this. I'd love to have a Midwest workshop because, so many times we have more attendees in the Mountain West or, bigger cities like, Atlanta and things like that. But I would love to have a workshop here in the Midwest for faith transitioners and their loved ones. So please consider coming. It's April 12th and 13th. We have several people signed up already. I'm still looking for a venue. So registration fees are waived if you would be so loving as to open up your home, because it can really lower cost if I don't have to pay for a venue. So that would be wonderful. And yeah, so tell your friends and family members that might be willing to come. Kansas City is close to Oklahoma City. It's close to St. Louis. It's close to Omaha. And there should be enough people just in the Kansas, Missouri area to support a workshop of this sort. So I'd love to have you come.
Excellent. And also Natasha has one planned in Oklahoma City, September 13th and 14th. So check that out. We're really trying to support the South and the Midwest with Natasha's presence there. And then finally, I'm really excited to announce that we're planning a conference called Thrive, Healing and Joy After Mormonism in Salt Lake City, June 7th through 9th. We want to cover several topics there, including navigating a faith crisis, having a healthy marriage, raising healthy kids, finding positive mental health and spirituality, healthy sexuality, etc. We want to bring Natasha in for that. We've already had several really cool people sign up. The whole focus is on just healing and growth after Mormonism. And it's going to be a great weekend, June 7th through June 9th. It's only $99 for the entire weekend. We hope to build community, help you find cool people to become friends with and to hang out with. So check it out. All these events you can register for at mormonfaithcrisis.com/events. So please check them out. Quick shout out to a few new donors since our last session. Shout out to Kendra, Whitney, Carol, Ashley, and Holly. All of them have joined us as new donors. And thank you for joining us, Kendra, Whitney, Carol, Ashley, and Holly. It's great to have support. If any of you are appreciating this content and valuing it, we would love you to go to mormonfaithcrisis.com, click on the donate button, become a monthly donor, and that will help us be able to keep this podcast alive. We're happy with the progress so far, but we have a long way to go to at least pay Natasha and Margi what they're worth.
And you need to stop saying that, because you need to be paid too. So all three of us.
Well, please donate if you can. Okay. So normally, also just if you can't support us with donations, you can like us, our Facebook page, Gift of the Mormon Faith Crisis. You can give us a positive recommendation. You can share these episodes on your timeline and social media. You can give us a positive review on iTunes or on YouTube. I don't even know if they allow that. You can email us. You can give us ideas. You can comment on Facebook when we put out queries for topics. And you can help us, spread the word about our events and attend. So those are just ways you can help us out, separate from becoming a monthly donor. All that is helpful. Now, we normally have a What's Working section at the beginning, but we've decided to go ahead and put that at the end, and we have a very special What's Working for you planned for the end. So we're going to leave that as a teaser. How does that sound, Natasha?
That sounds fine. People will laugh at the end when they realize why.
All right, we've got a really special What's Working.
Oh no.
So stay to the end. All right. So the big topic, by the way, I want to give a shout out to those who have joined us live on Facebook. Victoria from the UK. It's always lovely to have you, Victoria. Fred's joining us. Fred, we've incorporated several of your topics. Carrie, Lexi, Clarissa, Ryan, and Jim, and many others have joined us as well. I saw Dusty up there. Thanks for joining us. We're excited to have you. We hope you will share your comments and questions and experiences as we are discussing these topics, because that will be also very helpful and engaging and valuable. I also want to say that I posted a few questions on several forums on Facebook just to gather tips and tricks and mistakes and stories. And so many of you responded. Mm-hmm. We're going to be reading several, almost probably all, or no, not all. 80% of today's session is going to be tips, tricks, mistakes, and advice from people's experiences. So we're just grateful for those of you who follow either the Mormon Stories Podcast Facebook group, the Thoughtful Transitions Facebook group, my personal Facebook wall. Any of those are places where we normally post. If you're not a member of those groups, feel free to join them, because that's where we're able to solicit. Stephanie and Jim just joined us. Welcome, Stephanie and Jim. And let's dive in, because we've got a lot to cover today. So the topic is communicating with church leadership, meaning bishops or bishopric members or stake presidents, elders quorum presidents, relief society presidents, whatever. Communicating with church leadership, ward members, and neighbors,
particularly in Utah,
specifically in Utah, during and after a Mormon faith crisis. And it's a sensitive topic. You know, the best example I have is, you know, I get this email in December saying, "Help, John, I'm a bishop, and how do I get out of being a bishop, and how do I communicate this to the stake president? How do I communicate this to the ward, to my bishopric members without destroying everybody's lives? How do I protect my family, myself?" And that's an extreme example, but so many of you have, you know, when you're going through it initially, you've got to figure out what to do with your callings, what to do with tithing settlement, what to do with the temple recommend, what to do with bumping into ward members, bishopric, etc. But you also, once you are, you know, need to get out of callings, need to say no to tithing settlement, need to maybe decline a temple recommend, how to do that, how to set boundaries. But then it even goes further. It's, what if you go inactive or semi-active and you find out you've been discussed in ward council, or you've been assigned ministers to come visit you and that feels yucky, or you feel like a project, or you're getting love bombed? How do you erect boundaries? How do you communicate effectively? How do you avoid, if you still want to open up the possibility of, if you're a man, baptizing your child or confirming your child or ordaining one of your children to the priesthood or whatever, attending a temple marriage or an endowment session with a close family member, and you want to keep your options open? How do you do that? These are all the types of things that we're going to be covering today. Natasha, is there any other, you know, sort of anything you'd add to this introduction to let people know what they're in for?
I think as you're presenting it, the only thing that's coming to mind is just making sure that people understand that faith transitions look very different for a variety of people. And so for some people, these things can happen kind of overnight or over just a few weeks, you know, where they want very clear boundaries or they want a separation. But for the great majority of people I work with, faith transitions are a slower process. And so they're still in contact with or active members of the church that are just less orthodox or less traditional, whatever word you want to use there. And so they're still having a relationship with their ward and stake families, and it becomes a little trickier in knowing how to navigate some of these things. So I just want to make sure that we're clarifying that we're talking about all of those types of transitions.
Yeah, absolutely. Did you want to add anything, Margie? We went through this as we got excommunicated and kind of had to figure out how to navigate the church. Even before, when we were liberal progressive Mormons, we needed to find ways to communicate with people.
Yeah, and I think also for those who are in mixed faith marriages, there are boundaries that you kind of have to consider too when people are asking you about your spouse. Right, and you may
where's John? Remember, you just get the where's John.
You may not feel comfortable being placed in a role where you're speaking for your spouse, and so I think that's something we'll touch on too. So, yeah, there's a lot to consider for sure.
And also, I guess it's important that we remind our listeners, this podcast isn't just for people in a faith crisis. We're trying to make it feel comfortable and safe for family members, church leaders, if they want to do a better job of supporting people in faith crisis, of understanding that perspective. We want to make this podcast safe and comfortable for them as well. So we intentionally manage the content in a way to where we make sure everyone feels comfortable listening, maximize the audience.
Yes.
Victoria writes, "This is so good. I wish I had this when I left. This will help so many people. Thank you. to all of you for your help, advice, and wisdom. I'm so glad this exists. I'm so proud of you all, and I'm grateful to support you.
Oh,
Thanks, Victoria.
we're grateful right back to you, Victoria.
All right, well, let's dive in. We have a lot to cover today. So the first piece of advice that came to my mind is I kind of have two approaches, the private approach and the direct approach. The private approach is founded on this idea that a religious faith crisis is private. It's your business. Nunya comes to mind, meaning none your business. In the East and in other places outside of Utah, people just would never ask you what church you go to or if you're active. And there's good human wisdom in that. So if it's true that it's private, and also what we found, and we'll share some of the stories, there are risks in being vulnerable and open. I like to say this idea, don't give them rope to hang you, meaning if you want to leave your options open for, like I said, ordinances or other things, temple work or just not being a product of discussion in ward council. You don't want to give them the rope to hang you by giving them information that could be used against you later or that could cause you to be viewed in a way you don't want to be viewed or discussed in a way you don't want to be discussed. It helps you avoid becoming a project. So there are a lot of reasons to just hide it and not talk about it and be super private. And we're going to be discussing those in some of the pieces of advice for those who have already written in. So Margi, what do you think, just as an overview of this approach? Do you have any thoughts about it?
A couple things that come up for me is intentionality, that you're very intentional in this process about who you share personal details with. And so again, that idea of vulnerability, who has earned the right to see those parts of you and to hold those parts, and really trying to figure out what level of relationship you have with the people that you choose to share with. So those are a couple things. This was definitely my approach, I would say, with regard to transitioning overall. And different strengths to, different approaches, not one size fits all, right?
Yeah, if I remember, the idea of you talking to the bishop, you're like, he doesn't deserve.
Well, I had no relationship really with the bishop at all.
So you just had no interest in talking to him.
It was very functional. So it was like if I had a feeling about being released from a calling, then my approach to the meeting would be very functional. It's like I have something that you need to be updated on. And then I would boundary around that and just remember when questions were asked, it doesn't mean I have to answer the questions, right?
You would have even maybe wanted to handle it over the phone or through email. I don't even think you would have wanted to give the time necessarily to even show up. Isn't that kind of the level of distance you preferred from ward leaders sometimes?
I tended to communicate directly, even if it was just with whoever was, if I was in Young Women's, with the Young Women's leader, but I tended to do it in person over writing.
Natasha, what are your opening thoughts on the private approach?
Well, I think that there's two things that get in the way of this approach. One is that, like Margi just said, just because a question is asked doesn't mean we have to answer it. That's really not something that we've been trained to consider as Mormons. So from a very early age, starting with baptismal interviews at 8, then of course all the young men's and young women's interviews, we are kind of growing up in a culture where you're kind of expected to go in and answer questions. And I think a lot of people growing up as members of the church just really don't even consider that boundary very much. And if you're going, and remember, and so the second reason why this I think is a problem is because remember, I don't think faith transitions happen overnight for most people. So it's not like they've got it all figured out and I know exactly where I'm going to land. And therefore now I know what type of relationship I want to have with the bishop. it's kind of, a lot of times people are going into their bishops and talking about these things because it's the first place they want to get answers. It's like, why are these things coming up? Do you have answers to these questions I have, especially historical issues, right? Or issues around polygamy. I remember even as a teenager going in and asking questions about polygamy, to my ecclesiastical leaders. And so I think that those are the two things that kind of stand in the way of a private approach, is that people, first of all, aren't taught that privacy is a principle we should hold to. We're very principled around honesty in Mormonism, right? And so honesty is seen as, it's kind of correlated with this idea that I have to answer questions honestly, which means I have to share what I'm thinking and feeling. And we don't really teach privacy boundaries, and that you can be honest and private at the same time. That's not a concept we're really trained to know. And then secondly, I don't think people oftentimes have given, because faith transitions can happen through such a long period of time, it's hard to know how to even have these kinds of thoughts about how I'm going to deal with the bishop when maybe you've already talked to the bishop about a lot of things as part of your faith transition. Does that make sense? So those are the things that I think stand in the way of the privacy approach.
I think I've said Mormons feel comfortable checking to see what underwear you're wearing. They feel comfortable asking you behind a closed door where and how frequently you touch yourself. And I don't mean that to be disparaging. It's just the reality. Other churches, those things may seem just kind of like normal to Mormons. In other religious traditions, those things would be viewed as deeply offensive, and you would just never, ever pay attention to someone's underwear or ask them if and how frequently they touch themselves, or have a young boy or girl alone with a grown man in a room. And it's not to chastise the church. It's just to say we're a very high demand religion. That's true of Jehovah's Witnesses. That's true of Scientologists. That's true of evangelical Christians. That's true of some really conservative Catholics. It's just part of our culture. And so I think I think you bring up a good point, Natasha. So a couple comments from our listeners. Victoria writes, "Yes, Natasha, this is so true. It is important for us to know that we choose. We choose what we want to discuss and who we want to discuss this with. We have the choice." Yes. Mm-hmm. And she has a bicep emoticon on her comment. So it's empowering. Fred writes, "And not meeting with him can be a powerful way to break that cycle of the bishop having power over you, your life, and your decisions." That's so true, Fred. Yep. Just saying, "Thank you, bishop, but no thanks. I don't need to meet." That's one option you have. Let's see. Leandra writes, "With how the church member structure is set up, it does not allow room for privacy, in the sense that everyone's aware of each other's presence in the church, attendance and roles. Naturally, members, even those who do not know you well, will find themselves probing for information."
Very true.
And that's so true. That's sort of the "Where's your husband?" this Sunday. Yeah. I haven't noticed him. In a mega church with Joel Osteen and several thousand people, you're just never going to be missed or noticed. But in a church with 200 people and you attend over years and years and years, everyone kind of notices. And that also makes it harder. That's a really good point, Leandra.
And we'll be talking about that later, actually.
And the Bishop's Council and other sorts of things. Mm-hmm. Okay, so we have several people on Facebook or on Reddit who wrote in and made suggestions or shared tips, tricks, or mistakes. And I'm just going to read through some of them. And Margi and Natasha, I want you guys to jump in and respond. Is that okay?
Yeah.
All right. So Somewhat Neanderthal, which is from Reddit, the ex-Mormon Reddit, just makes the simple statement, "Don't talk to them. That was my approach anyway. Good luck. This is hard." That's just but it's important for people to know that's an option, right?
Yeah, and I think it's really empowering for people to have the sense that they are deciding what type of relationship they want to have. So.
And I think it's also important to just say people have different relationships with different ecclesiastical leaders. Some people have very dear friendships and close relationships with their ecclesiastical leaders, while others kind of like you said, Margie, with yours, it was more utilitarian, or you didn't know each other as well. At the same time, what I want to remind people about is that we have a rotating door of ecclesiastical leaders. So, if your faith transition is going to be a 15-year process, which that's not uncommon, you're probably going to have, 3 bishops or 4 bishops during that time frame. And so and one thing I think is also very important to talk about in this kind of context of privacy is that we kind of stink at confidentiality in Mormonism. And so what's shared with one particular leader, may be shared with the ward council, and may be shared with their spouses, it may be shared with other leaders as the transfer of the baton is given. And so once information is out there, it's no longer, it no longer belongs to you. And it can be used in ways that you wouldn't always anticipate. And that can be very painful and hurtful. And that's just a reality that we're dealing with. And this isn't, as if there are ecclesiastical leaders listening, this isn't because I think ecclesiastical leaders are mean or want to ruin your life. I just think we have an idea that people have different bishops deal with faith transitions in different ways. Some bishops are very loving, very inclusive, will give you callings, will be very flexible. Others will be very rigid and keep you from baptizing your child, keep you from attending the temple, keep you from the marriage of your adult child. And so these things have huge implications for family life, for mental health, for stability, for all kinds of things that people are dealing with on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, in my coaching practice, actually, back to kind of what Natasha was saying around boundarying kind of being this new language, right, that we don't come by naturally. One thing I recommend that has proven really empowering and effective for people sometimes is we literally will look at conversations that they will likely have that they feel like are coming up, and we script them and they practice them. They practice the words they want to say. They envision what will they be asked and doing that for the most part with warmth, with a level of you're in a safe place and this is how it works. And so that's something that can be very, very helpful given the fact that we're quite unpracticed at this idea, understandably, of what boundarying looks like.
And Juliet writes in, she says, "Dear friendship didn't keep our bishop from taking my spouse to lunch and humiliating him. The deeper the friendship, the more trauma when the leader calls you stupid or faithless. No, it can go surprisingly very wrong." And so, when I said some people want to share because they're closer with their bishop, sometimes can go very well. And sometimes because you have that kind of intimacy, people are more willing to share their negative thoughts about it, are more willing to kind of hold you accountable, are more willing to, say, hey, this is not okay what you're doing. And that can feel very affronting. So I think Juliet makes a good point that don't just assume because the relationship is close that it's going to go in a relationally healthy way.
Great point.
So good. So true. So we have several people who've shared their experiences, and we're going to just read through some of them. And some of these are positive, some of these are negative, and I think they illustrate most of the principles we've discussed. So Mikkel, we'll go, and Margie and Natasha, we'll take turns reading these. Is that okay? I'll read Mikkel. So Mikkel wrote, it felt so violating. I had confided my faith crisis in a bishop, and he was the first person I was open with about it. So I felt extremely vulnerable when I talked with him. I didn't realize that he would openly discuss what I had told him with my fellow ward members. Months after this, a friend in the ward let me know it was being discussed in ward council, and I felt sick. I knew I would never be able to trust a bishop again with any of my struggles, and it also made me feel like all the love I had felt in the ward wasn't real. Everyone's motive was just to make sure they didn't lose another sheep. After realizing this, I met with my bishop, and in tears, I told him I was done meeting with him. He seemed a little dumbfounded that I would feel like this was a violation of trust. He said he was sorry for how it made me feel, but not sorry he sought help from ward members. I don't plan to ever confide in a bishop again about my faith struggles. It's just too personal for me. And
Yeah.
as someone who did 6 years of a PhD in clinical and counseling psychology, and Natasha, I know you'll be able to confirm this, confidentiality is the first thing you're trained about as a mental health professional. You literally, before you begin any client relationship, they sign a waiver. You discuss it overtly, the limits to confidentiality, which include if you say you're gonna take your life, or you're gonna harm someone else, or you're aware of a child or a vulnerable person being harmed, that there are limits to that confidentiality. However, other than that, as long as you are 18 or above, you are assured as a client that everything you share, including the fact that you're even a client at all, will be held in the strictest of confidences. And for some reason, bishops, as far as I know, and stake presidents don't get that sort of confidentiality training. What's been your experience, Natasha?
Well, and this is kind of what I was referring to earlier, is this is not our structure. Our structure is even bishops who say, no, I take confidentiality very seriously. I would never share, or even wouldn't necessarily share ward counsel. They still have the right to get consult. And who do they get consult from? Well, from their stake president and from an area authority maybe, or somebody. And of course, a lot of these things can lead to disciplinary councils too, which are, again, inviting more people to know what's going on, because now they're going to have a role in whether or not, your membership is going to have some type of, kind of consequence to it. So we really are not a structure. I can understand the dumbfounded look of the bishop, because the bishop is part of the structure that is not set up for confidentiality. It really isn't. The structure is get help from other ward members, talk about families and ward council, again, with good intentions, right? We want to reach out, we want to help, but now people know a lot about your business that isn't appropriate for people to necessarily know at all, especially on such a topic that is so personal. I don't even know that we really understand that faith transitions are a very personal, confidential matter. So in other words, like some people would say, well, I would never share that maybe a sexual, thing with another person,
or like a rape or something.
I would never talk about that in ward council, right? But quite frankly, faith transitions are very personal, very private, have a lot of implications. A lot of people are related or have friends or work in a community where people may not even go to your business anymore if they feel like you're struggling with your faith. And if you're talking about that in faith council, like how are we going to help brother so-and-so strengthen his faith, you have now messed with professional issues, possibly family relationship issues. It's intense. And I don't think that we really are set up for knowing how to deal with this correctly.
We're not. One of our listeners, John Curran, he just shared the following. Let me find it really quick. I'm lost on the comments. John writes, confidentiality was a joke with most of the bishops I spoke to. They outed me to other members of the ward, to their family members, etc. And I think John will be comfortable if I acknowledge that when he says outed, he means his sexuality, not just his faith crisis stuff.
Which that's a horrific faux pas. Horrific.
And yet bishops wouldn't necessarily be trained on that, because there isn't necessarily training on that, right?
No. This is one of the big problems with the lay leadership, is the tremendous lack of training when it comes to people's mental health, sexual orientation, faith transitions. The most private aspects of our lives are dealt with by clergy. And I used to think lay clergy was such a wonderful thing about our church. And as I've really started to understand the role that people play in that role and the lack of training, I just really have done a huge turnaround in that.
Margi, why don't you read us Martine's comment? We love Martine.
I've not talked to any leaders about my faith transition. I have a good relationship with my bishop, but I've never felt a need to explain myself because, as Karen Sundberg said, they don't own me. It's a nice feeling to realize that. My husband is a former bishop of this ward. We're on the same page.
What do you think about that?
Yeah. Well, I definitely, I mean, that's the way to go. And I think with this approach, it makes sense, especially within the structure we're talking about, where it's so high control and there's this enmeshment with information where it's shared and it becomes, something that lots of people know. And then before you know it, because of the high control that values us being the same, we're othered in an instant. It's just kind of a high cost scenario. So it's a very valid approach.
And it's an empowered approach. For Martine, she still attends church. But I just like it that she's just saying it's my own business.
Yeah.
This is why, can I just say too, this is why if you're listening to this, and hopefully you are before you start making some of these decisions, it can be wise at front, even though you may want to go and talk and consider things, and even though you may still be very active and have a calling, it can be a wise approach to take this process slowly and maybe talk through some of these things with somebody who isn't as involved, like a coach or a therapist or somebody outside of the Mormon church, so that you can get some perspective before you start putting yourself in a very vulnerable position. If you don't mind, John, I'll talk about the next two comments. So
wait. We just got a comment from Gerardo, and I think you're a perfect person to read and answer that one first. Do you mind?
No, not at all. So
Okay.
Gerardo says, one of my friends in college started going to family services for counseling, and he told me they gave him a paper that said that if the ward was paying for the counseling session, the counselor was allowed to disclose any information with his bishop regarding the counseling sessions. The way to keep the counselor from disclosing information to his bishop was if he paid for the sessions out of pocket. What are your thoughts about this? So I was a contractor for LDS Family Services at the very beginning of my kind of career. Well, after drug abuse, then I went to LDS Family Services. And so I understand the paperwork that they're talking about here. And I'm not exactly sure how it's presented by all therapists. I'm just going to kind of give my perspective on this. They do have, as part of their general paperwork, a release of information for the bishop who is paying for the services oftentimes. And that's presented kind of in generic fashion to the clients, which I think is very problematic. What clients need to understand is that they have a right to refuse to sign that paperwork, and they still should be able to have access to the therapy. So it should not be presented in a way that if you're not willing to sign this, we will not pay for your therapy. If bishops are doing that, then that should be placed. I would place a formal complaint to the state board if that is happening. That should not be how it's happening. I remember several people telling me they were not comfortable signing that. And I was like, that's fine. I would explain to them, just like you can sign a release for your doctor, you can sign a release for your other therapist, you can sign a release for a school counselor, you can sign a release. And sometimes I actually recommend signing a release with a clergy member, especially if I want to be able to talk with the clergy member or feel like the clergy member could help, be trained in some way that might be helpful. So I'm not saying that all disclosures with clergy member are bad. And I've even done that with other faiths. But this kind of blanket, that you should, and now the therapist, and I think some therapists do a better job than other therapists in this. I was always very careful what I actually shared with a bishop. So I was like, they're making progress, they're making good use of your money, they're showing up to sessions, things like that. I was not like, here's the details of everything we talked about. And I think some therapists maybe do that.
Folks can't assume that
once you sign a release, you've signed a release of information, and the therapist can kind of, so they can be talking about your faith transition and things like that. So you have to be very, very careful when working with LDS Family Services to know your rights, to know what you're signing, and to know the therapist's perspective on what they're actually going to be sharing with the bishop.
So
and most members don't know that. Most members, when I presented the paperwork, they were like, "Oh, of course, sign away." They didn't even question it.
It's the church. It's got to be okay.
We come from that culture. And I would be the one that would kind of pause. Now, remember, this is, you don't have to sign this. But they'd be like, no, of course I'd want my bishop to know. Of course, because again, there's not that sense of privacy. It's like, because the bishop in a lot of ways represents God, right? And so Why would I want to keep anything from God? So when you have people representing God, this is where it becomes problematic.
Love it. Juliet, we love having Juliet join us. Juliet writes, one good benefit for being outed as a faith transitioner is it helps others start looking into why. Not that it's legit or not that it's right, she says.
Mm.
That's a side effect. That's some lemonade from the lemon of having been outed, I think.
Maybe a tablespoon of lemonade.
All right, Natasha, what else are you going to read, Natasha?
Well, and I'll just say, as that's also not necessarily great, because when other people start looking into why, usually in that process, that's not a happy, oh, I'm so excited to look into why. They're usually pushing back on you and very upset and confused. And if they're going to take out any of their feelings, it's going to be kind of on you. So even though that may be a benefit in the long run, if she wants to think about it that way, it can also come at a great personal cost in the process of that. Anyway, the comments I was going to read went back to confidentiality. Colobian says, never expect confidentiality with anyone in the bishopric. And Hiram White says, also understand that pretty much anyone who is in or around the office will pick up confidential information. I learned way more than I should have as an assistant financial clerk. Financial clerk. And I would absolutely second this. This is a huge problem. It just is. And I remember being I was Relief Society president, and I was a counselor, in several of the organizations. And I remember sitting in ward councils going, and this is in my very believing kind of more TBM days, even then thinking, I'm not sure that if the people we're talking about were present, that we would be talking about them in the way that we are. And secondly, that they would want us all to know this information. Yeah.
And we're going to cover ward council in a bit, but that's totally legit. Margi, why don't you read Luna Live Long Lovejoy?
Okay. Even as a young women counselor, the young women president I worked under, who had a husband in the bishopric, used to divulge all sorts of really sensitive stuff to us as a presidency, always under the guise of caring for our girls and their needs. But it left me shocked and disgusted, like, wasn't that supposed to be confidential? Basically, if any of our girls had ever been on church welfare or confessed to a sin, I knew all about it. Sometimes I knew about their parents' sins too. That never sat quite right with me and taught me to never say
jack stuff
to our bishop ever.
I just edited.
That was good, babe. Just right. Yeah. I have definitely, I think, amidst some young women meetings, felt that level of discomfort as well, feeling like I was hearing things that I shouldn't be hearing.
And it's a whole different topic when you're talking about the youth. There's because there's this, already as adults, we're being treated kind of as perpetual adolescents, but with the youth, they are adolescents. And so their information is not treated private at all.
Yeah.
Especially when it comes to sexual indiscretions or things like that. If one party confesses, the other party is brought in, whether or not they even wanted to confess. There's all kinds of stories that are so just really problematic when it comes to boundaries of our teenagers. Really, really problematic.
Now, just to be clear, are you saying that teenagers are more fair game because they're minors, or they're less fair game because they're minors?
They're more fair game.
No, but what, in your opinion, what should it be?
Less fair game.
Right, right.
Less fair game, but they're more fair game because, they're minors. We see it. We all kind of like parent them. So we all see ourselves, especially the leaders, as part of their parenting paradigm. And we take, I think, rights that we don't have. and I think the actual parents are okay with that because, again, it's part of our structure. It's kind of like the ward is raising the kids, right? And so when, a parent will oftentimes bring their kid, even against their own wishes, to a bishop for a confession or things like that. And so, and if kids are going through faith transitions, which many times they are, that has huge implications for their social status, for how they're treated in the ward, dating possibilities, mission possibilities, all kinds of issues.
Emily writes, same thing happened to me in Young Women's Presidency. That's referring to the previous comment. Amy writes, I've learned way too much confidential information just by attending ward council, also by living next door to a gossipy Relief Society president. Yeah, there just needs to be ward training. There's so many things that the church cares about that they want to control, like, tea and coffee, or, law of chastity stuff, or modesty. What if there was the same level of concern and even punishment around gossip and respecting people's privacy?
And I can say that I did not receive one iota of training on confidentiality as a Relief Society president, not one. I had that training because of my profession, not because of the church.
Yeah, and I would even add, I like the idea of providing support, emotional support. If leaders are going to hold, the pain of members or parts of their story, or they're going to be asked to hold that, I like the idea of providing them emotional support to do that, and spaces that, reinforce that confidentiality, so they don't have to go to the neighbor and start talking about it, or to other places.
Love it. Okay. Margi, why don't you read Angela?
The one mistake I wish I could change was answering too many questions. I thought I was speaking to a friend, someone I could trust. She asked so many questions to gauge where I was, and I answered honestly, openly, and kindly. However, she went to the bishop, and I was shunned by the ward. It was horrible. I wasn't quite at the point of walking away yet, and was pushed out. To sum it up, don't overshare. That's painful.
Good advice from Angela. Sorry for your pain, Angela. I'll read No Engineering, and then Natasha, you can do Karen. No Engineering from the Ex-Mormon Reddit writes, early on, I took the approach of state the issues to my bishop. He proceeded to respond with phrases like, it sounds like you are trying to convince me, and I'm not sure that's accurate, meaning Joseph Smith marrying other men's wives. I finally realized that this guy had no idea of really any of the historical issues and had no idea what the church essays even were. This was in 2017, I'll just say editorially less than 2 years ago. He writes, I would not engage with any church leader unless they were aware of the issues. It is completely pointless in my opinion. However, it did validate the severity of the suppression of information by the church. But the information has always been there. Anyway, that was a sarcastic comment. Anyway, he writes, I guess a more accurate term would be the pushing of a false narrative rather than information suppression. In any case, my bishop had no idea. Stake president had a very poor understanding and had never heard of the second anointing. It was a waste of time, and I shouldn't have met with either of them, but on a positive note, it was validating to me that the issues were ugly and the church doesn't like discussing them. So again, another vote from No Engineering around not discussing and the private approach. Natasha, why don't you read Karen?
Well, before I go there, I would say this has been my experience as well, is that you go in wanting to talk about, real issues, doctrinal issues, historical issues, and the person who you're meeting with may have zero idea about what is happening. We had a bishop as well that was not aware of the gospel essay topics, which is put out by the church itself, right? And so it's very difficult to have these conversations. And for those who are listening who might be believers or, again, ecclesiastical leaders, you have to understand that it's not that, people are necessarily wanting to convince you or wanting to change your mind about ideas. At the same time, this information is out there. So if you're not aware of it, or if you don't want to be aware of it, you're going to probably be dealing with some level of tension or conflict as people are really struggling with this information and trying to make sense of it for their own perspectives. And in families and in ward communities, it's hard to have conversations that are really kind of open about faith transitions if we can't really even look at our own history. So it's a struggle, and I think that the church, in some ways is trying to open up the history, but in other ways it still keeps it very tight-lidded. And then I think that the ironic comment that No Engineering was making, is this idea that when the information is out there, because it's out there, oftentimes the blame gets put back on the faith transitioner. So that, people are like, well, that information has always been there. Why is it bothering you now? But the reality is that that's not our lived experience. Our lived experience is not that the information has been forthcoming. So it's another way to victim blame the faith transitioner. And that's a real problem that we have going on in our culture. All right, so Karen says they are not.
Wait. Can I just jump in?
Yes.
And thanks, Natasha. I'll just add that we had one of the church historians, I think it was Snow, who admitted that the church has intentionally not publicized the gospel topics essays. They are in the apps now, the mobile apps, and there have been some bishops have been made aware of them, but they've never been mentioned in general conference as far as any of us know. And they basically Elder Snow admitted that they don't want to infect members and especially leaders with the virus of doubt and questioning. And so they wanted them to be available on the website for plausible deniability, for people who really need or want questions answered. And even then, limited information was given, and you had to click more and more and more to be able to get the full essays. That's true today. And even the essays themselves are viewed as lacking context, as whitewashing, as being incomplete or inaccurate. And so, yeah, the way the church handled the essays on the one hand is a real positive step forward. On the other hand, they continue to intentionally withhold the information from most of the membership because they were in this double bind of wanting to be able to say that they've shared it, wanted to be open with it, but at the same time, not wanting to infect the membership. And that's the bind that the church leaders are in.
Mm-hmm.
I agree. And I think that we have to get over that idea that information infects. Information is information, and we're just going to have to deal with it one way or the other. I think, unfortunately, we're having a backfire effect when the information isn't shared. That's not going to actually help the church in the end. So I'm sad to see that. All right, so Karen says they are not clergy, they are not even counselors, and in many cases they're not even nice guys, especially general authorities. Many are disliked by their own families and employees. They will not keep a confidence like real professionals. Be careful what you tell them. Also remember they have no authority over you, only what you give them. I will echo and emphasize, be very careful about meeting with a general authority. They are in their position because they are successful, usually wealthy, powerful men. They don't care about you. So this is, obviously a more negative framing. And this is where I would like a for me in front of these statements. For me, these are things, because I don't think this is how everybody feels about general authorities. And I think general authorities themselves are complex creatures that I probably hesitate to just call good or bad or evil or wonderful. I think that people are complex, and that includes our general authorities. At the same time, I think Karen's making some really good points here. I think the point of authority is really the issue. And somebody mentioned stewardship. I forget who it was it was Emily Walker. She says it's the concept of stewardship, and stewardship equals no privacy. And I think that there's something really important for us to consider, that people in authority, because we are a top-down system, can have an impact in your life that you did not see coming, such as taking away your temple recommend, such as, having advice for your spouse, that oftentimes, especially in mixed faith marriages, I'm continually shocked at how many times a spouse will tell me that a bishop or a stake president encouraged a divorce because of a mixed faith relationship. That is just shocking to me. And again, when we come from the context, because again, faith transitioners are not just all of a sudden not in Mormonism, right? And can say, oh, I've got authority and I don't have to believe what you say. We are coming from a place where we have been taught to trust and to see these people in authority as having their best interest for us, and also for having stewardship, which means they have the right for revelation for us. And so even if you're in the midst of a faith transition, that can be a very confusing space when you feel like, I don't know that I really want to divorce my spouse over this, but my bishop just, maybe has insight that I don't have, because we're not really taught to trust our own volition over church authority. We're taught to trust church authority first. And that's an invitation I would like to offer anybody who's listening anywhere on the belief spectrum is to really start challenging that, because I don't even think it's a very Mormon concept at all. So I think it's a really unfortunate concept and cultural tradition that we need to abandon quickly.
Mm-hmm. Love that.
So this will be the last comment that we share from this topic about the private or the closed approach. It's from 7 Places. And Margi, I want you to read it, and I'm curious what you think about it.
You don't owe anyone an explanation of your beliefs. That includes yourself. Just let yourself change over time without having to decide exactly what you believe or explain to anyone what you believe.
What do you think about that? Saying you don't even owe yourself an explanation.
Yeah, I love how process oriented that is and how kind, because I think it is a process that takes time. And, sometimes in trying to pin it down or to explain it away, it has the potential to complicate things for ourselves and for our relationships. So
I love this comment. I think it's so antithetical to how we function as Mormons.
That's so
because
true.
we want to know, right? And just because you were a believing Mormon doesn't mean that you still don't take that process with you in your spectruming, right? So now I want to know what I believe now. And this really opens up this idea of ambiguity and ongoing journeys and processing, and that we don't need to land in any one space just yet. And why I think the conversations with the bishops can be extremely difficult, because there isn't a lot of room in active Mormonism to have ambiguity. In order to get the temple recommend, in order to have the calling, in order to participate in certain things, you kind of have to have a certain level of surety in a lot of these ward cultures, and so it's really complex, but I agree that would be a wonderful way to approach life, is with ambiguity.
I agree. And that loosening for me, I know amidst my Mormon transition interview, I talked about how belief was more of a distant idea for me, just not as useful in my day-to-day amidst transitioning as it had been when I was really largely identified with being a church member. So I love that as well, with that part of the statement. And even building on what you were saying, Natasha, this idea that, amidst transitioning and beyond, there are just mysteries. There are things I am comfortable saying that there are plenty of things I don't envision ever knowing. There are just mysteries to being alive. And I am fully comfortable with not knowing oftentimes, and living in a mystery of yeah, I wonder how that really does work.
I love it.
I want to share a comment from Emily really fast, just to, be a witness to what we were talking about. She says, that happened to me 6 years ago when my husband left the church. The first thing my bishop told me after meeting with my husband was that I should leave him if he ever prevented my activity in the church. I think he was trying to be supportive, but looking back, it is appalling that this was his first piece of advice. And I agree.
Agreed.
It's really good people doing really horrific damage.
Yeah.
Amy writes about the risks of talking to your bishop. She writes, I avoided speaking to my bishop for more than a year after my faith crisis began. Then it was time for my son to be baptized. My husband is still in the church, but was told he couldn't confirm my son because he didn't have a temple recommend. My husband explained he only didn't have one because he was behind on tithing. That's only because I wouldn't let him pay. I was furious and went crying into the bishop's office and outed myself, hoping only to save this mess I had created for my poor husband. Oh. I was told by some that they would never withhold a temple recommend from a man based on his wife not letting him pay tithing. So I thought I could change my bishop's mind by being honest. Wrong, she writes. This is sad, and I laugh sometimes at sad things. Apologize. She writes, he told me, meaning the bishop, that my husband should be able to stand up to me and fulfill his duties to the Lord. Mm. He then went on to give me horrific advice on how to work my way through this crisis I was in. I spilled way too much and regretted it the second the words left my lips. Bottom line, bishops don't have the answers to your questions. there's no good that can come from opening up to them ever. Which again, that's the for me. I'm hearing Natasha say for her, that was her experience. Kristen Gluth, Cranny writes, that's awful. She's so sorry. Thanks for joining us, Kristen, and for sharing empathy for Amy. We're so sorry, Amy, that happened to you.
It is awful. It is awful. And this really shows the bishop's roulette on these issues. Because I've had many people that do have the experience where a bishop will completely honor, if one person isn't comfortable with tithing, the other person isn't held responsible for that, and the marital unity is prioritized. And then you have these stories that happen just as often. And it's really, really horrible. And that just, it's a very patriarchal view, and it's seeped with the toxicity of patriarchy, in this idea that men should be able to control their wives' faith journeys. My goodness. What's Mormon about that? My goodness.
You don't like the bishop saying that the husband should stand up to the wife? You don't like that?
No, and that's been said about me in my ward. So I guess I'm particularly upset about that one. That hits a personal chord where, my husband has been told that it's interesting he can't keep me in line.
Emily writes for a happy ending. She says, luckily I ignored his advice, and now my husband and I are stronger than ever. So that's a good outcome. So we're happy for you, Emily.
Yes.
Okay. Well, so that's the first big topic. And now it's time for the second, which is the direct approach. And the direct approach is just being honest, open, and transparent. As you mentioned, Natasha, that's one value, right? That's, there are many values we can have, including a value of privacy, a value of self-preservation, a value of safety, but you can also have a value of openness and honesty and transparency. Often this comes from sort of a missionary zeal that we come by honestly as active, devout Orthodox Mormons. We want to be as zealous and as open and transparent as doubting, questioning, or post-Mormons. Sometimes we also just believe in honesty. Sometimes, as a listener mentioned previously, we feel like, I think Juliet mentioned this, that there's an altruistic motive to speaking openly to everybody so that they can also become aware of the problem. So sometimes it comes out of a motive of wanting to spread the awareness or the joy or the information or the pain, whatever it may be. We often just want to share it. Some comments made just in the opening that this works best depending on how invested you are in any particular outcome. Did you want to mention that, Margi?
So I felt like that was important to add. I also think if you're not attached to other people who might be invested in that outcome, so relationship-wise, would be important as well. Because once you do that and the information is out there, we often can't control, of course, what ensues systemically from there.
So if you've got a great financial job that's not dependent on the church, if you're not worried about word getting around, if you've got a lot of confidence in people gossiping about you or spreading rumors, and if you're not concerned about that affecting your spouse or your kids, if you have a spouse and kids, and you just can stand boldly in your truth and there's really no fear, I can see how the direct, and that's an extreme example, but that certainly can be an environment where the direct approach could be a little bit more palatable,
less problematic.
And we're gonna have other people share why they took a more direct approach, but obviously there is a benefit in managing the story and not allowing other people to write your narrative for you. It can alleviate ambiguity so that people know exactly where you stand. Those are all potential benefits to the direct approach. Natasha, did you want to comment about this direct approach before we actually read some of the stories?
I think the only thing that I'll say about the direct approach is that, again, we don't want to just assume that directness means I'm no longer believing. I have this idea that these things are wrong or these things are not true. Like, the direct approach can make room for a lot of nuance. So I'll probably be reminding us about how that looks along the way. So I just want to say that. Because again, not everybody goes from like believer to non-believer, right? So
No, most people don't. Most people, it's a multi-year process, right?
right. And will stay involved in a nuanced believing state for forever even. So I guess what I mean by that, just to give a quick example, is I remember one time somebody asking a question, well, how do you answer, like, do you sustain the leaders? Honestly, again, that principle of honestly. And one gentleman raised his hand. This was in a faith transition workshop we gave, John, together at Sunstone. And he said, I answered that very well. I sustain my leaders. I tell them exactly what I think is wrong about what's going on. So that was his, he could answer that in his own mind honestly, but with a twist that some people might see that as dishonest, right? And so I just want to make room for honesty being something other than just literal, 100% it is or it isn't these things, because honesty can be rift with ambiguity and nuance as well.
I like that. So what I hear you saying is you're kind of keeping us away from binary thinking.
Right. Because I think that like I remember, feeling, especially with temple recommend questions, and I know we'll get to that, so I don't want to necessarily just jump into that, but a lot of people feel like they have to say a yes or a no in a very literal way to some of those questions, or even tithing, how we pay tithing. I'm a full tithe payer only if I pay a certain way. Whereas I think that you can be honest and have a direct approach with ways that are more creative than that and not feel dishonest in that process.
I love it. So we're trying to develop some flexibility, right?
Yes.
Very, very good.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so as we jump into this kind of open approach and the pros and cons, the direct approach, I'm going to read something from Anthony Miller. Anthony Miller is a prominent voice in the progressive and post-Mormon Facebook communities. I believe he lives in either Wyoming or Montana. Just a super wise, thoughtful guy, and we're trying to get him.
He lives in Montana, by the way. I know
Montana?
that.
Yeah.
Yes.
And Anthony, we're trying to get him to speak at our Thrive conference in June. He writes great stuff, and I just pasted a couple links to his stuff in the live feed, because he's got a great blog where he's written out a lot of thoughtful things that he has to share. But I'm going to read a little bit of Anthony Miller's writings here. Anthony suggests, as you're contemplating your direct approach, he writes, understand your motives. When considering if or how much to share with family or friends or ward members, I'll add, I consider, what is my motivation? Do I just need boundaries and space? Is it more about me and my desire to provide reasons or justifications for my unorthodoxy or for my sabbatical? Is it because I desire loved ones to mourn with me? Is it my desire to be understood and accepted by them? Do I feel a need for them to understand what I've experienced and concluded because I want to be validated by their reaching the same conclusions in case I am making mistakes? Is it because I really want to understand their points of view and how they deal with the mess? Is it because I don't want to be judged, shunned, or even banned by not participating in something like a temple marriage or endowment due to my change in beliefs? As you consider these questions, know that unless they are able to unpack some of the things on their shelves, it is nearly always counterproductive to get into the weeds of the messy issues with them. As we used to do, they have likely interpreted their spiritual experiences as God giving them certainty of subject matters, doctrines, rituals, practices, behavioral norms, and standards, and the divine inspiration and discernment of church leaders. Then when they encounter something that may cause them to question or that causes them dissonance, they are practiced and skilled at, quote, putting those things on the shelf with faith, same as we used to do. So Margi, what do you think about it, Anthony asking us to really look inside and analyze our own needs and motives before we take that direct approach?
Yeah, the first thing that strikes me is this actually works for both approaches. I think these are wonderful questions that we all can ask so that we're quite self-aware with regard to where we are in our own process and what we're really seeking and why we're wanting to have conversations. So that's what kind of strikes me, is this is just a beautiful way to kind of get to know ourselves, period, no matter what approach we want to take.
Natasha, what do you want to add? Anything?
Just, I agree. And I just, again, I wish that we had, like, you know, we could hand this to every person right at the very beginning, right, of faith transitions. And the reality is that I just know from experience that probably people who are listening to this may have already made decisions before they have access to this type of information. So a lot of times it can be hard to know how to step back or how to correct or repair things when things maybe have already gone a certain direction that was unanticipated. So I just wish we had these in a manual or something, you know, like that was, imagine if the church had a manual for helping people around faith transitions. It was actually not just self-interested, right?
Mm-hmm.
So people would have this kind of information right from the get-go.
And I'm sure they will offer that someday, and I'm sure it'll be based on our work, at least partly, because that's kind of how it often rolls.
But you know, I love that point though, because given all the great resources that we could put out there, there's just no stopping the fact that this process is difficult. And even with the best, you know, kind of tools at our disposal, we're also unpracticed at a lot of the things that all of a sudden come to the forefront that we will need to navigate this. And so I really love, I feel like we should say it almost every episode, you know, this kind of we're easy with ourselves, we're gentle with ourselves, that we realize that, you know, the goal is not perfection. The goal is never to, you know, to avoid all conflict, or that we're going to be these, you know, stellar navigators where there's just no problem. And because I feel like that sort of, I don't know, it seems to fuel that narrative that we're responsible for how it goes. And if we're prepared enough, it will all work out. And so just a big old dose of self-compassion in this journey, that it is tricky for the best of us, for those of us who really tried to prepare and do everything right. And so just love to you all, you know, as we're all just trying to do our best in really tricky places at tricky times.
That's love from Margi to all of you.